Hey, what's up, everybody? Sorry we're a little late here. I'm waiting on Aaron. I am in Nicaragua, and yeah, you don't rush around here, so I was a little bit late. We're live now on Rockfin as well, and we're going to cover basically two issues today. I'm not going to be on Jimmy right now. I'm going to be on Jimmy later. But we need to debunk all the lies that Robert Kennedy Jr. told on Jimmy Dore before he told the untruth that he was going to debate me or agree to a public dialogue with me. And welcome to award-winning Canadian journalist based in New York, Aaron Mate. As I said, I'm in Nicaragua, so I'm not in anywhere where I can look slightly less disheveled than I am. This is like my worst lighting situation possible. I'm an angle person, so I like to have the camera above me. That's like a good angle for me. This is a terrible angle for me. So, but anyway, we're going to do the thing today. We are going to, there should have been, RFK should have put his money where his mouth was and just gotten in the lion's den to show that the facts were on his side. But what he did on Jimmy Dore, Aaron, was he just lied for a half hour straight about Palestine. And it wasn't just, he's doing this because the lobby controls American politics. Like, he enthusiastically spouted racist lies about Palestinians and justified Israeli policies of targeting civilians that are some of the most heinous in the world. There was no reason for him to go that far, but he chose to do it. And so he needs to be held accountable. And it's painful because he's positioning himself as a peace candidate. He's positioning himself as someone who will end the wars and take on the neocons. But what does the neocon project center around? It centers around Israel. So we're going to talk about that. And we are going to talk about the latest Trump indictment around January 6th. Aaron, do we have a special guest lined up for today?
We have the only person really I think worth listening to when it comes to January 6th, and that is Michael Tracy. He has been covering the indictment just on Twitter, and Michael's tweets have been hilarious and totally on point in talking about the farce that this latest indictment of Trump is and the media reaction to it, and how Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, has taken the place of Robert Mueller as liberal media's #1 heartthrob. You remember when Robert Mueller was investigating the Trump-Russia conspiracy theory, which every liberal blue and on pundit believed in with all their hearts. Robert Mueller was sort of was a heartthrob, and there were columns in Vogue magazine about he's America's crush, and there was an article in the style section of the New Yorker about Robert Mueller's Brooke Brothers suits. And now Jack Smith, who runs triathlons, is the replacement as the latest heartthrob for liberal media. And it's such a joke. And Michael Tracy will be joining us to make fun of it as only he can.
Well, that's great because I haven't been able to follow it as closely as he probably has.
It's been really funny. It's been really, really funny. And Michael Tracy's been having a great time with it. And again, just the hyperbole, which is a soft term, which is like around January 6th and how we almost lost our democracy and there was a coup. It's just such a joke. And by the way, this is the same people who all stood up and applauded when Trump tried to install a puppet, Juan Guaido, as the president of Venezuela and actually incite a real insurrection. That was an actual insurrection inside Venezuela, including an attempted military coup. And these are all the same people who applauded Trump for that. They're now screaming about how a 3-hour riot on Capitol Hill almost spelled the end of U.S. democracy. So, yeah, Michael Tracy will join us to discuss that. But this Bobby Jr. thing, should we start with that?
Yeah. So I'm gonna just for everyone watching this probably knows that Bobby Kennedy Jr. went on Jimmy Dore's show. Jimmy Dore's been very sympathetic to his campaign. On August 1st, after delivering a series of Likudnik tirades at pro-Israel events in New York or marching in the Israel Day parade. You know, his rhetoric has really escalated since he was accused of anti-Semitism for making some convoluted remarks at a private New York City dinner about genetically targeted bioweapons. He said he wasn't sure about whether they were true, but, you know, this obviously fed the manufactured outrage of his opponents within the Democratic Party establishment. And so he's just been on this tirade where he thinks that if you defend the extreme right government of Israel and its occupation and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, that will somehow show that you're a friend of the Jews, as if all Jews support this, as if all Jews are ultra-Zionists. In some ways, that's an anti-Semitic construction. But regardless, I just wanted to go through what RFK actually said to Jimmy Dore and debunk some of it, because pretty much everything he said was a lie, offensive lies. Even the commas and periods in the transcript of his comments were lies. It was shocking. Yeah. And it calls into question his credibility as an anti-war candidate and in general. If you're just going to get up and just lie and just make stuff up out of nowhere, your credibility has to be questioned. And I don't care how much I agree with you on some other issue. It has to be questioned. And Jimmy, obviously, you know, he hasn't spent years. You and I have both covered this issue for years. He hasn't been to Palestine. I have. He hasn't spent like extended time there. Neither has RFK. But Jimmy's not pretending. The one thing you can say about Jimmy is he's not a phony. He's a real guy. And so he admits that he's not an expert on this. And so he, you know, deferred to me. And RFK was kind of allowed to stampede at certain points because Jimmy didn't, you know, have the, he might have not, I mean, just watch the way RFK is talking. It's like he's a lawyer in a courtroom and Jimmy's just being a straightforward interviewer. So anyway, I'm going to play this at like 1.5 speed just so we can get through it more quickly. And we'll stop it at certain points and, you know, respond to some of this just bonkers propaganda that you don't even hear as much from like AIPAC lobbyists. This is like extreme propaganda that, you know, you might have heard like 30 years ago from your racist Zionist grandpa.
Scenario. So you have a terrorist who you've caught, who you know knows there's a bomb that's going to kill tens of thousands of civilians. And the Israel judiciary has said, even in that case, you cannot torture him. No other judiciary in the world says that.
So he's saying Israel doesn't practice torture. Israel helped pioneer torture techniques, including the helicopter technique.
As you know, there's, I think, 3 of the 12 Supreme Court justices are Palestinians. There are Palestinian judges all over, as there are legislatures, and it's guaranteed, you know, full participation of Palestinians in the electoral process. There's 1.9 million Palestinians in Israel who vote. They elect legislatures, are represented in the judiciary, and they practice freedom of religion.
So he's saying Palestinians are more free in Israel, the Palestinian citizens, than anywhere else in the Middle East. He doesn't know the history. For example, that there are 100,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel who are not allowed to return to the homes that their families lived in before 1948 and are internally displaced because of the absentee property law, which handed over all property left by ethnically cleansed Palestinians in 1948 to exclusively Jews through the Israel Lands Authority. The Israel Lands Authority is essentially controlled by the Jewish National Fund, which gives land exclusively to Jews. And that's why you see Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, who are Bedouins, be ethnically cleansed in areas in the Negev, like Al-Araqib, a village that I've witnessed be wiped off the face of the earth by Israeli border police. It's been demolished over 70 times, and then they're put on these kind of reservations. There's the law of return, which gives me and you, Aaron, the ability to be Israeli citizens simply because we're Jewish. But you have over 5 million Palestinian refugees who actually have roots in Palestine who are never allowed to return because Israel needs to maintain its Jewish demographic majority. So we have 2 countries, Palestinians have none. Then there's the
And that's the key point, Max. Just to stress that he's conflating two different sets of Palestinians. So yes, there are Palestinian citizens of Israel who have citizenship and they have some nominal rights, but he's conflating them with the millions more Palestinians who live under Israeli rule in the occupied territories who have zero rights and who are and constantly face occupation and dispossession. So their existence is completely erased from his narrative here, which itself is false because there's so much discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel to begin with. But even that aside, he's just in saying that they're part of the judiciary, they have rights. He's erasing the many more Palestinians who live under direct Israeli rule, but have zero votes and zero rights.
The Jewish supremacist state of Israel restricts who Palestinian citizens of Israel can marry. They are not allowed to marry thanks to the ban on unification, family unification, which is also known as the citizenship law, which was passed in 2003. They can't marry occupied Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza. Why? Because Israel's afraid they'll make babies and they'll make too many babies, and then they will someday outnumber Jews under Israeli state control, not Israeli military control. It's according to Adallah, which is a human rights NGO in Israel, an Arab human rights NGO. It is one of the most racist laws in the world. And indeed it is. It would be like the US government passing a law that would restrict Americans from marrying people from Mexico, for example, or from Great Britain. And it's because Israel's national identity is defined along ethno-religious lines, which is fundamentally undemocratic. We can go on with these racist laws that Palestinian citizens of Israel face, along with racist violence, but let's listen to more lies.
They guarantee protection for gays. There was a pride parade 2 weeks ago in Israel with 150,000 people in Israel, in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. At the same time in Iran, they were hanging gays from cherry pickers.
Okay, at the same time in Iran, they were just hanging gays from cherry. Where's the evidence for that? He just made that up. And does gay rights give Israel the right to occupy millions of people militarily indefinitely just because gay people can parade around and dance to techno music in Tel Aviv? I mean, that is just classic pinkwashing. It's the kind of thing that we would only expect from neocons. I don't know what he's, was there some recent news about Iran, like recently hanging gays from cherry pickers? And he makes it sound like hundreds of gays are just hanging in Iran.
It's the only place where women have full rights. It's the only place where Palestinians can legally complain about.
By the way, women in Israel cannot get divorced, Jewish women, without a blessing from a rabbi.
Their government with no fear of reprisals. Oh, anywhere else, including the West Bank. If you complain about extremely corrupt governments in the West Bank or Gaza, you risk your life and you'll face torture and death.
So right now there are massive protests in the Gaza Strip, which is controlled by Hamas government, for better conditions. They're directed against the Hamas government, and no one's being killed. Yes, those are repressive governments. People have been tortured under the US-funded and Israeli-backed Palestinian Authority and are under Hamas leadership. But you can protest there. You can criticize the government without being killed. He's just making that up.
And again, how many tens of thousands, or maybe it's hundreds of thousands at this point, Palestinians have been imprisoned by Israel for resisting the Israeli occupation, whether it's non-violently or violently, it doesn't matter. They have the right to resist regardless. That is the ultimate form of dissent, to resist an occupier. And for that, they're imprisoned and tortured. People spend years in prison. Back when Palestinians...
For protesting, for waving the Palestinian flag is now considered illegal in Jerusalem, in parts of Jerusalem. Palestinians have been arrested for Facebook posts. It's the speech is heavily restricted for them. And then in the West Bank, I mean,
how many people are just shot or imprisoned for doing nothing, just for existing as Palestinians?
I've witnessed it. I've witnessed it in the small farming communities where the apartheid wall was built across their land, separating them from their own farmland. And I witnessed them being shot with rubber bullets, with tear gas, with even live bullets, being arrested in their beds, even children being arrested for simply protesting without weapons the loss of their land. And he's painting every single one of them as a terrorist.
The judiciary in Israel is unique in the world. It's also said you can't pressure people putting pressure on their family. You can't pressure terrorists in that way.
That's totally false. The judiciary in Israel authorizes the Israeli military to destroy, demolish the homes of Palestinians who have attacked Israeli military targets. That happens all the time. It's collective punishment. Israel is the master of collective punishment.
And you know what's amazing here?
I have a feeling
that you've been playing this on whatever, like on like a faster speed than normal, and we've barely gotten into his comments. But look how many times we've had to pause him to correct him, because as you
everything
said,
he says is a lie. Literally everything Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says is a lie. In this interview.
And by the way, one more thing I want to clarify, Max. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think you were asking to debate RFK Jr., as many people are saying. You just wanted to talk to him and have the chance to be in dialogue with him about this really important issue and come at it in good faith as someone who agrees with him on many other important topics. You wanted to have a discussion with him. As I understand it, you weren't trying to debate him, right?
Well, in the beginning, I've put in a request for an interview long ago, and they put me in the icebox. And we have a lot of viewers. We have 300,000 subscribers. Between the two of us, we have like 1 million Twitter followers. I mean, it would have been seemingly in their interest, but for some reason, they weren't interested in an interview. And so Jimmy kind of blindsided him here. But yeah, it could have been just you, Bobby, you say what you want. You have your time, and then I have my time. But I didn't want it to be something where I just kept cutting in on him and, insulting him. Anyway,
look, as we've made clear and we've defended him before, there's genuine appreciation. I know many people who watch the Grayzone feel the same way for his stance on other issues. For me personally, what he says about Ukraine and the proxy war, I really appreciate what he's done there. I think it's very important. He's spoken up for Julian Assange. I really appreciate all that. And it was just so shocking to me to hear what he's saying about Palestine and hear what he's saying. And I wanted to have the chance to tell him how I felt about it and actually present him with some contrary facts that I think he's missing. And that's,
fact checks.
Yeah.
Well, let's keep the fact checks going.
That happens all the time. I mean, again,
but you can go to jail for it.
But I'm not right. But I'm not I'm not an expert.
And you can sue people.
Okay. So I get your defense of Israel.
No, yeah, but I'm not, and I'm not saying that I'm not going to oppose, and I'm co-signing, every.
So you don't mean unconditional?
No, I don't mean, and I mean unconditional, because we give $3.5 billion to Israel every year. Now we give $2.3 billion to Egypt, which has no human rights, and we give $1 billion to Jordan, which has no human rights, and we give $800 million a year to the Palestinian Authority, which uses that money to pay bounties to Palestinians who kill Jews, not government officials, but Jewish civilians. So if you go to
that is just a crazy lie. But before we even touch that lie,
it gets worse.
He doesn't understand that the U.S. gives $2.3 billion to Egypt and $1 billion to Jordan in order for them to keep their own citizens under repression so that they don't resist Israel.
Yeah.
The whole point of them having repressive governments is so they don't do what their citizens want, which is to actually defend Palestinians against Israeli violence. That was the whole point of the Camp David Accords.
Yep.
But then he says that the Palestinian Authority for the U.S. taxpayer dollars are going to, through the Palestinian Authority, to pay for bounties to kill Jews anywhere.
Israel. And if you kill a Jew anywhere in the world and you're a Palestinian, the Palestinian Authority will pay you money for that. And
that is just like an insane lie. It's a laughable lie, because the Palestinian Authority is paid by the U.S. to arrest Palestinians and essentially to defend the Israeli occupation. That's why the Palestinian Authority didn't intervene when Israel sent 2,000 troops to raid Jenin. It never does. Its only role is to arrest Palestinians, control Palestinians, and then provide Palestinians with a pseudo government so that Israel doesn't have to take responsibility for its own occupation. That's why Congress funds it. The Palestinian Authority's military side was trained by a U.S. General Keith Dayton, under the Dayton Plan, which was also overseen by Tony Blair at the time, and DynCorp, a U.S. mercenary firm. I've seen those mercenary trainers in restaurants in Ramallah in the West Bank, like having drinks, like they're all around. I've seen the Palestinian Authority come in to refugee camps and arrest Palestinians in the day. He doesn't understand even what the Palestinian Authority is. There's no record of them paying bounties to kill Jews anywhere in the world. And no one, and I lived in the West Bank for months and months. No one cared if I was a Jew or not. He's never been there. He's just lying.
Yeah.
And they will.
I don't know enough to push back on this.
So I know. I think there's this narrative, and particularly on the liberal left, that says that that portrays Israel as a kind of occupying nation sitting on.
It's a kind of occupying nation. It's a kind of occupying nation. Like, he's not even acknowledging that an occupation exists. It's just a left-wing narrative.
And the whole thing is a lie from start to bottom.
It's a lie?
A little bit about
he said the whole thing is a lie, that there is no military occupation. Even in Israel, they call it hakibush. That's the term for it. Even like Ariel Sharon or major Israeli generals and prime ministers acknowledge that there was an occupation. They don't deny that. They just justify it on the basis of security.
Yeah. Israel and Jordan were part of what was called the British Mandate when the Ottoman Empire, in 1922, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, we went to war. The Palestinians were on the side of the Ottoman Empire against the Allies. The Jews were on our side. They were.
I mean, it's like he doesn't even know what he's talking about. The Palestinians didn't have any choice but to be under the control of the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't like they went to war on their side. They just were living under the Ottoman Empire during part of World War I. And he says the Jews were on our side. By the way, we weren't on the right side in World War I. World War I was a disaster that set the stage with the Treaty of Versailles for World War II because Germany was so badly humiliated. And Woodrow Wilson just used it to establish American empire. So I don't even know if he understands the history of American empire here.
But also, it's like the history. It's like, what does all this matter? Like, let's say Palestinians were on the wrong side back in World War I. Does that justify murdering a Palestinian kid, denying them food and medicine, stealing their home now? It's nonsensical. But again, he's going to go into the propagandistic history here, which is always
it's a weird one though. It's bizarre. Like, I know the propagandistic history because I've seen all the Hasbara, studied it. This is something kind of original. Like, I give him credit for originality.
More Jews in Palestine at that time than there were Palestinians.
There were not more Jews in Palestine.
Such a lie.
That's just a huge lie.
Yeah.
That's why the Arab Revolt broke out 1936, I believe, because of the Peel Commission, which was giving prime property, including the ports, to the Jewish population at the expense of the Arab or Palestinian majority. The Zionist movement would not accept UN Resolution 181 because it was going to partition Palestine in a way that would have placed 50%. It would have had an even demographic between Palestinians and Jews within what would have been Israel. That's why they needed to do ethnic cleansing, to get them out of there so they could have a quote unquote Jewish state. So he just makes this up.
Palestinians. But at the end, the Ottoman Empire disappears. And so there's a lot of land that is part of the Ottoman Empire. And the question is, what do you do with that land? Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations said, what we're going to do is we're going to give it to whoever lives there.
That's not true. It was Sykes and Picot who basically, through the Great Game, crafted in 1916, not at the end of World War I, but in 1916, the British Mandate of Palestine. They just carved it up through a secret agreement that was signed on to by Russia. By the way, it was the Bolsheviks, when they took power in Russia, who exposed this colonial plan, which doomed Palestinians. It was along with the Balfour Declaration. The Bolsheviks exposed that. So, I mean, he's saying it was, a League of Nations, just kind of a United Nations style agreement. No, it was just raw colonialism that gave the British Empire the mandate over Palestine.
Whoever lives on that land now is the sovereign of their own country. Well, they took Palestine and they said, there's half the people, a little over half are Jews, a little under half are Arabs. So we're going to cut it in two, and we're going to give half, part of the Jews, part of the Arabs. But there was so much anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic bigotry at that time that they gave 4/5 of it to the Arabs and 1/5 to the Jews, just a tiny sliver 9 miles across to the Jews, tiny little piece of land with their sacred sites that were not Muslim sacred sites ever. So
that's not what the Balfour Declaration said. I don't know where he's getting that from.
That was the original distribution. And then in the 48 war, when Israel got its statehood, they were immediately attacked by by Egypt, Jordan, Syria, all the surrounding countries, and Lebanon, and miraculously beat them off. The Palestinians were on the side of the attackers.
They were on the side of the attackers in 1948, when over 400 Palestinian villages were ethnically cleansed. Over 700,000 Palestinians were forced off their land into oblivion. They were on the side of the attackers. Like, he doesn't even acknowledge the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing. 200 villages had already been ethnically cleansed, including major urban neighborhoods, by the time Israel signed its quote-unquote Declaration of Independence in 1948. Then the 1948 war, he said, oh, Israel just won miraculously. It didn't win by a miracle. The government of Egypt, which was a fake government, a fake monarchy, did not actually attack the Zionist movement or what would become Israel. It was basically a volunteer force. The only real force that attacked was the Royal Jordanian Legion, which had been trained by a British military expert, Pasha Glub. And through a secret agreement that was actually negotiated by Ben-Gurion with then King Abdullah, they agreed to stop at the Latrun Gap at this line, and they would get part of Jerusalem, what is now East Jerusalem, and Israel would essentially be created. They didn't continue on. There was no other real force fighting Israel. And then what Israel proceeded to do in 1967 was, and we'll get to this part of his Lie Fest, Hasbara Fest, is ethnically cleanse the villages that it couldn't get to in the Latrun Gap, so it could build a highway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, Beit Nuba, Inwas, and Yalu. And it forced the citizens there at gunpoint to march to Ramallah, and then destroyed all of their villages and all their homes. And then the Jewish National Fund built a forest called Canada Park with a Canadian government grant on those villages, an artificial kind of forest, so that they could never return. He doesn't know anything about this. This is like the Leon Uris Exodus propaganda version. He watched some movie with Paul Newman.
The key point here in response to what he said, I think, is that when he talks about the Arab states attacking Israel, at the time that the Arab states finally entered the war, Israel had already expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes in ethnic cleansing campaigns, as Max was talking about. So this idea that Israel was founded and then the Arab states decided to get together and just attack it to erase it from the map. No, they intervened after months and months and months of Israel ethnic cleansing Palestinians and stealing their homes and forcing them to flee. And then the myth was that was created was that the Palestinians decided to voluntarily leave their homes to help their Arab allies attack and kill the Jews. It's also cartoonish and ridiculous. If you don't believe all the Palestinians who still have the keys to their original ancestral homes, who can never go back, if you don't believe them, there's plenty of archival evidence of this, including from Israeli historians. It's all admitted. It was all planned to commit ethnic cleansing, and that was the real plan.
And they massacred them in Tantura. They massacred them in Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin, by the way, they built a mental institution over the Palestinian village of Deir Yassin. The people of Deir Askalun, which is now Ashkelon, were rounded up, placed in a concentration camp until 1950, surrounded by barbed wire, and then they were taken in trucks and dumped in the Gaza Strip, where their offspring now live in an open air prison. The reason they can't return to what is now Israel is because they're not Jewish. So
the real honest Israeli historians are people like Benny Morris, who say, yes, there was ethnic cleansing, but he says it was necessary. So at least he acknowledges the fact of what happened. He just happens to be enough of a bigot and a chauvinist to justify it. Whereas
he said it was necessary and we didn't do enough. That's the problem.
There we go. Yeah. So RFK needs to read people like that who ideologically he's aligned with, but at least are more honest on the actual facts.
In all of those countries, all the Jews were expelled. So all of those countries expelled every Jew in the country and took away.
I mean, do we need to go into this? I mean, there was the Lavon affair. There was the bombing by the Zionist underground movement in Baghdad of Jewish community centers. The Zionist movement actually encouraged terrorism inside those countries against Jewish people or destabilization actions in order to precipitate the exodus of their Arab Jewish population, because they would absorb them and start, using them as human fodder in the demographic trench war against Palestinians.
Something like 27 million square miles of land that were just taken away from them. And those Jews were all sent to Israel. Israel did not do that to the Jews, to the Palestinians in Israel. It allowed them to stay.
Did you hear what he just said? He said Israel did not do that to the Palestinians inside Israel. It allowed them to stay. I mean, he just straight up denied what happened in 1947, 1948.
I was in Lebanon a few years ago, and I went to a Palestinian refugee camp, and you go there, you talk to people. Everyone's got a story about what happened to them or to their family members who were kicked out of their homes. They still have the keys to their homes that they can't go back to.
Yeah.
And that's Palestinians all around the world. Does he think they're all lying? Does he think all the Israeli historians who have documented this in meticulous detail based on the Israeli archives that they're all lying? I mean, it's insane what he's saying, and we really can't stress that enough.
He's running to unite Americans. Do Arabs exist in America? Do Palestinians exist in America?
Yeah.
I mean, these are just like, this is the moral equivalent of Holocaust revisionism to them. And he's just completely denying their history, their humanity, and then he's claiming that he's running for all Americans.
Well, it's been attacked. It was then attacked in '67, and the
wait a minute, there's another lie. I mean, we've advanced 5 seconds and you get another. Israel was attacked in 1967. Israel attacked in 1967. It destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force before Egypt was able to do anything or had any plans to do anything.
Yeah, and Israel claimed it was preemptive because all the Arab states were planning on attacking it, when meanwhile, Israel had been shelling parts of Syria to try to get a reaction because they wanted all these countries to attack, because they wanted an excuse to then occupy the land, which they exactly did. So 67 is a great example. Israel says it's a defensive war, but somehow in the so-called defensive war, Israel ends up stealing all this land that it really covets. It takes the Golan Heights from Syria, it takes the Sinai, and it takes the West Bank and Gaza. How many defensive wars end up with a country that's on the defensive stealing and occupying more land than it had when it began? It's incredible. And I mean, again, there's so much scholarship done on this too. It's like, even in Israel, I don't even know if this argument is made anymore.
Well, even in Israel, they say, well, it was a brilliant, like Michael Oren wrote this propagandistic chronicle of the 67 war. And he acknowledges that Israel attacked first, but he said they did so because it was out of strategic necessity. But RFK doesn't even know that they attacked first. Yeah. They started the war.
And from its attackers, the Palestinians, again, were on the losing side.
Oh, they were on the losing side, so they get to have all of their stuff taken, all of their land taken. That's what we do. If you lose, it's just a Hobbesian world where the more powerful military force gets to take everything and militarily control you indefinitely because you're the loser.
But it took strips of land from the attackers, which is the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. And then Israel said, look, we want to give it all back. But we're not going to give it back because you can attack us from those parts. We're not going to give it back unless you promise us peace. If you renounce violence against us, if you admit that we have a right to exist, we'll give it back. Egypt said yes. And Syria got the Golan Heights and Sinai, and they got it back.
Do you hear what he just said?
Syria got the Golan Heights? That's news to Syria. Yeah. That
would be news to Donald Trump, who got his own settlement named after him in the occupied Golan Heights, Trump Heights.
And as you said earlier,
he doesn't even know that the Golan Heights is still occupied by Israel.
Yeah. And as you said earlier, Egypt made peace with Israel. And what Egypt got was basically Egypt agreed to neutralize itself and no longer stand up for Palestinian rights. That's basically why Egypt got a peace deal. It wasn't about recognizing Israel or basically, and Egypt also got bribed with billions of dollars in annual U.S. aid. That's another thing that Egypt got. And this idea that Israel should be trying to give all the land back. And he goes more into this. He repeats the lies about the Oslo peace process and the Camp David Accords.
Egypt got the Sinai Peninsula because they attacked Israel in 1973. They liberated their own territory where Israel was building settlements in a surprise attack that was masterfully planned. They also sold out Syria so that it didn't get the Golan Heights because they wanted to be at the only people at the table in Camp David. So he doesn't even know the basics of this history. He doesn't even know what happened in the 73 war.
Jordan wouldn't do it. Oh, they and today you have, the Palestinian Authority, and in Gaza, if you kill a Jew, you get a street named after you. The children are taught.
What?
That's projection. If you kill Palestinians, you get squares named after you. You get stadiums named after you in Israel.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
another
there are memorial monuments to the Etzel Brigade and Lehi and all of the right-wing terrorist groups that participated in the Deir Yassin massacre all over Tel Aviv, including the Etzel Museum, which was built on the ruins of the ethnically cleansed neighborhood of Menshia, which is just south of Tel Aviv.
But from kindergarten, killing Jews is an act of patriotism and 85% of those countries.
They're taught, Palestinian kids are taught from kindergarten that killing Jews is an act of patriotism. I mean,
people in those countries when polled believe that it's okay to kill civilian Jews and that it's okay and that Israel has no right to exist and their purpose is to destroy Israel and to exterminate the Jewish people. Now, Israel, on the other hand, only deliberately attacks military targets. So civilians do get killed. But for example, in Jenin, in the recent battle,
it only deliberately attacks civilian targets. So here's one of the clips that, well, this was, I mean, film I made.
Look at 2014. Look at 2014.
Film I co-produced, Killing Gaza, just puts the lie to that. But here's, my first day in Gaza. I'll show some I'll have to
like in 2014 in the assault on Gaza in the summer, I'm thinking of when they attacked UN refugee camps. Those 4 Palestinian boys playing soccer on the beach, all these residential homes, residential apartment buildings leveled. There's just countless examples of this. And
this was my first day in Gaza. This is a picture I took of the neighborhood of Shujay. It was completely leveled to the ground by the Israeli military.
Yeah,
completely leveled. Everything there was destroyed by Israeli howitzers, and beyond it is Israel, and buffer zone.
And again, and when he even says it's the word military target, I mean, even that is misleading because Palestinians don't have a military. There are a group of people who are resisting a military occupation. They don't have an army. They don't have, heavy weaponry that they can launch at Israel. They have homemade rockets, and they have people who are defending their own territory and resisting an occupation, which, an occupation he doesn't even seem to be aware of or doesn't want to know.
Here's a Sharuk Tower blown up by Israel in the Gaza Strip. This is a major office tower and residential tower, and it's home to media offices. I know because I've worked out of that building. I've been up and down that building. It's home to families who rent.
Yeah.
It has no military value at all. Israel attacks it as part of its Tahiyya doctrine, which is designed to, it's named for an entire neighborhood in southern Beirut that Israel destroyed. And it's designed to demoralize the population so they turn against their leadership. And it's failed every time. It has a literal doctrine of attacking civilians. I mean, I don't even know if we need to, he goes on to defend the Israeli raid of 2,000 soldiers on the refugee camp of Jenin, where hundreds of people were wounded, thousands of people had to evacuate. He claims no civilians were killed. That's totally false. And they destroyed the hospital there. It was bombed by jet, by helicopter. There were tanks rampaging through the town, and he says Jenin is a bomb factory. Israel didn't even raid Jenin because of suicide bombings. There hasn't even been a suicide bombing campaign since 2000, the early 2000s, and the last suicide bombing I could think of was 2007. It was because they're forming armed resistance factions that aren't controlled by the Palestinian Authority and are defending their own territory against Israeli military and settler incursions. Either he doesn't know that or he just believes propaganda. But I mean, I think we can kind of just.
The last thing I want to say, I just want to say one more thing on this, and then we can move on, is during this interview, he also talks, and we saw a bit of it there. He talks about Israel's always been trying to give the land back, and they've offered Palestinians all these generous peace deals, which these greedy Palestinians who want to destroy Jews have always rejected. It's a complete myth. And there's a long story. I've covered it a lot before, but it's such a lie. And it's a lie that's trotted out to justify the ongoing occupation and U.S. Israeli policy since the Second Intifada, and basically cracking down on the Intifada and increasing the colonization of the West Bank. Anyway, Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was the Israeli foreign minister at the time of Camp David, the peace talks in July 2000, brokered by the U.S. between Ehud Barak of Israel and Yasser Arafat of the Palestinian Authority. Shlomo Ben-Ami was Ehud Barak's foreign minister. Okay. And Camp David is supposedly, according to the narrative that RFK Jr. was parroting, Israel offered Palestinians this generous peace deal that would have satisfied all their national aspirations. It would have given them East Jerusalem as their capital, most of the West Bank, all of the Gaza Strip. That's the narrative that RFK Jr. promoted. Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was the foreign minister, the Israeli foreign minister, he said on Democracy Now! When I was there, he said, if I were Palestinian, I never would have accepted Camp David. Because he pointed out accurately that the actual Israeli offer was simply to keep all the major West Bank illegal settlement blocks, Jewish-only settlement blocks, carve up the West Bank so that Israel takes what it wants, give Palestinians the rest, and rather than giving Palestinians even parts of East Jerusalem, to basically take a suburb of East Jerusalem that's not even actually East Jerusalem and rename it East Jerusalem. And that could be the Palestinians' new capital. And this is like, if you're a Palestinian right there, this is like the center of Palestinian cultural life is Jerusalem. And Israel was asking Palestinians to basically take an adjacent place and rename it Jerusalem and call it their capital. So that's a lie, just like everything else RFK Jr. says. And as someone who really admires what he said on so many other issues, especially the Ukraine proxy war, I was shocked listening to it. And it's disappointing, but I'm not surprised at all that he declined the opportunity he claimed he would take to discuss this with you, Max. And I hope he changes his mind.
Yeah. Well, I don't think he is. And his communications director was not indicating that he's going to debate anyone except for Joe Biden. But just in closing, I mean, RFK did respond to a challenge by an interviewer at one point. I'll tweet it out later. He said, if you can debate me and show me that the facts and where I got it wrong and change my mind, then I will admit that I'm wrong. But if you can't, then I'm right. Well, I mean, that's what we're doing here. And he's not going to change his mind. He just hired the fanatical Morton Klein, or brought him on as his Israel director. Morton Klein is a guy whose Zionist Organization of America fell apart because, just like with Shmuley Boteach, fell apart because of financial unethical finances, and Sheldon Adelson came in and rescued it. So he's bringing on all these Sheldon Adelson funded characters. Morton Klein has publicly denounced Palestinians as filthy Arabs on his Twitter account. He's just a racist. He knows he's a racist cretin. And if he's going in that direction, he doesn't want to know what the facts are. And I have to question his credibility as a peace candidate if he's doing this, pushing for war with Iran, spreading lies like the one he told in Congress, where he said that it was a genocidal program that the U.S. gave $2.8 billion to Iran. He was actually referring to the U.S. giving a sanctions waiver to Iraq so that Iraq could pay Iran for gas that it received. So he's referring to cross-border trade between Iraq and Iran as a genocidal program. He has no idea what he's talking about. And, just because I'm disgusted by the lockdowns and the mandates and everything that RFK correctly opposed, it doesn't mean I'm just going to give him a pass on this major issue, which really is paramount as an American. I'm also offended as a Jew that he somehow thinks that if he expresses the most extreme ultra-Zionist position, it's going to make him seem like a friend of all Jews. That's not the way Jews think, and we're not all the same. But I'm out of there, man. Like I don't believe in politicians. They all need to be held accountable. And just because you're running against Biden doesn't mean I'm going to just give you a free pass. So, and yeah, we got to move on. Aaron, I don't know if there's anything. We do have a great guest in the green room, or it looks more like a white room.
Yes, we do. And we're very grateful that he's been so patient and waiting for us to bring him in. Michael Tracy, independent journalist who writes on Substack. Michael, welcome.
Hello. I'm biting my tongue about the RFK Jr. stuff. I don't want to return to that discussion, but
maybe I should just bite my tongue. Let's just say you were skeptical of RFK Jr. from the start.
Well, I mean, I'll just kind of say one quick thing.
Sure, go ahead.
If his thinking or if his logic is so obviously, disordered or incoherent on this subject, is it really that much of a stretch to think that he might have arrived at other positions which you might circumstantially agree with by a similarly kind of incoherent thought process? I mean, there's no real tangible, at least as I've seen it, kind of through line between his views on things. But everybody is just so desperate to say, oh, thank you for raising this issue that I really agree with, when it doesn't. I mean, you have to kind of step back and analyze the candidacy as a whole to see if you're just being pandered to. And I don't know. I hesitate to reward pandering.
To me, I've seen it happen a lot. People get duped very easily, and I like to believe that he was duped on this issue. And
how many times does the guy have to be duped? He's 70 years old. He told Glenn Greenwald, oh, yeah, I got duped by Russiagate. And then Glenn's like, oh, yeah, isn't that wonderful that he got duped by Russiagate in his late 60s? But now at 70, he finally saw the light. And we're supposed to be impressed by that and view that as a credential for him running for president, not as a demerit. It's a merit to have to be a dupe.
The problem is
not a demerit.
Michael Tracy started this commentary by saying, "Can I say something real quick?"
Okay, yeah, let's move on.
Which is the biggest lie you've ever told. No, I'll say real quick in 10 seconds. I think RFK Jr.'s in a way playing a positive role by just making this debate possible and allowing us to get some traction here. If he wasn't there.
I'm
not saying based on what he's saying. I'm just saying
it's predicated on a total myth, which has to do with his family lineage. That's the only reason he's been running in the first place. It's not because he's like a brilliant philosopher king that he figured out all the remedies for fixing our ailing.
Michael, he has a track record. He has listen. This is the last debate I want to have because I'm really
we can do it. I'll bring you back.
He has a track record as an attorney who has done something. It's not just anyway. But listen, I think we should move on because we brought you on to discuss the.
No, we can bring you back to talk about that. But
I'm supposed to be interviewing myself at some point, so maybe I should just put that.
We got about 20 minutes. Wait, stop. We have 20 minutes.
Okay, let's go.
Michael Tracy, your thoughts on the latest Trump indictment? Just go.
Yeah, I mean, the first thought is that if you read it, it's an incredibly zealous criminalization, outright, unabashed criminalization of what had previously been understood universally to just be ordinary political speech and political conduct. Now, obviously, Trump attempting to do what he did in the aftermath of the 2020 election and contest the results in a variety of ways was not ordinary as a whole. But the actions that he took in isolation, meaning to criticize the Secretary of State of Georgia or to, attempt to express certain political grievances around the manner of election administration in Arizona or Wisconsin, or whatever, those on their own are not particularly extraordinary political acts or incidences of political speech. But now Jack Smith, the prosecutor, has concocted this overarching theory that posits that all that conduct taken in totality could be seen as now a criminal conspiracy. And that really is an alarming aspect of this that's, on a kind of broad-based level, really ought to give people pause.
And one of the things you pointed out was that we've been primed for years now to believe that Trump committed incitement and that he would be charged for that. But yet, as you point out, that charge, incitement, is not mentioned at all in the indictment.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you remember this phony baloney January 6th House committee, special committee on January 6th that was co-chaired by Liz Cheney, put out a report in December of last year where they meticulously and tediously went through every last little detail of what they claim transpired on January 6th and in the run-up. And their ultimate recommendation, even though they had no power to do so, it's not like Congress authorizes these committees to make criminal referrals, but they claim that they had the power to issue a criminal referral. And one of the crimes that they referred, quote unquote, to the Justice Department was incitement of insurrection, because there is a federal statute there is a provision of the Federal Criminal Code that does make a crime the incitement or the commission of an act of insurrection or rebellion. So that was what was proposed as something that the Justice Department could charge Trump with by the January 6th House Committee. Now, Jack Smith has not gone along with that. He had the option, in other words, Jack Smith, of formalizing and ratifying this idea that January 6th constituted an insurrection and Trump was the insurrectionist in chief, but he chose not to. And yet that's not going to make anyone question whether this term that's been propagandistically inundating us for the past 2.5 years actually is accurate, even though, in the one test that would have actually been, constituted some kind of adversarial format for adjudicating whether insurrection is the right term, the prosecutor balked and decided not even to go with that statute.
So what's in the indictment that you find so objectionable? I read some, as I said, I've been on the road, so I haven't had a chance to read the indictment. I've been reading a lot of children's books to my kid, however. And so but I've read some of the parts you've screenshotted. At one point,
that's all you need.
You did hit on some very curious passages. One which says that Trump knew that the election had not been stolen from him, and he had been informed that it had been not stolen from him, and yet he proceeded anyway to tell his followers that it had been stolen. So how did they know that Trump knew that? And where is the crime there? And what else are you finding in the indictment that's objectionable?
Yeah, so one of the novel theories that they've concocted in order to prosecute Trump on these grounds is they assert, meaning the prosecutors, assert that Trump knowingly lied, meaning he knew that his claims about January 6th or about election fraud or about the impropriety of the election results, he knew them to be false and yet made the claims anyway, with the theory being that that transfers Trump's speech outside the realm of political speech and into fraud, which therefore makes it criminalizable in the way that it wouldn't be if it was just Trump making a contested political claim and then others disagreeing with it or making their own contested political claim to counter it. Now, there's no evidence cited that Trump knowingly lied about anything that he said regarding January 6th, other than they cite Trump being told or informed that what he was saying was apparently untrue or allegedly untrue by members of the Justice Department, by certain of his campaign advisors, by Mike Pence, by a whole gamut of other people, that somehow it's meant to be probative of Trump knowing that what he was saying was false. Now, even if a politician does knowingly make a false statement, it's unclear, very unclear, whether that could constitute a criminal act. Otherwise, you're criminalizing politicians lying, which is kind of a regular occurrence. But even beyond that, I mean, Trump's conduct doesn't really make a whole lot of sense as I see it, if he did not, on some level, genuinely believe what he was saying. Otherwise, why would he have taken such extreme action? I mean, do you get the impression that Trump secretly knew all along that there was no election fraud in the 2020 election? That's not the impression I ever got.
Well, if Mike Pence says something to you, it has to be true.
Yeah, but that's the novel theory that the prosecutors have gone with. And interestingly, Jack Smith, before he became the special counsel overseeing these dueling Trump investigations, so Jack Smith, remember, also has presided over this classified documents case where he resurrected the Espionage Act to charge Trump. Jack Smith, prior to November of 2022, was on loan from the U.S. to the International Criminal Court at The Hague, where he was the lead special prosecutor for the Kosovo Tribunal. So the U.S. allowed for several years, actually several decades, has allowed for U.S. personnel to be used in international criminal court proceedings pursuant to Kosovo, because it's one of the exceptions they carved out that permitted U.S. engagement with the International Criminal Court. And Jack Smith, lo and behold, was the person who was in that role. And in international law, international human rights law, as they put it, whatever you might want to say about it, at the very least, it's pretty much universally acknowledged that there aren't a whole lot of binding precedents, meaning you kind of make it up as you go along. It's not like you have a constitution. It's not like you have the U.S. Constitution that bars you from taking certain prosecutorial action because it would violate the Fourth Amendment or the Fifth Amendment, et cetera. It's basically just at the whim of the prosecutor or at the authority that's in power. And that's what Jack Smith had been doing for the preceding 4 years before he was brought over by Merrick Garland to take on these Trump investigations. Hence, the kind of sprawling, freewheeling creativity that Jack Smith has used to go after Trump on January 6th, and then also the documents case, where they decided that for the first time ever, a dispute over the retention of presidential records was going to be swiftly transformed into a criminal matter, whereas there really had been no expectation that that was even going to possibly take place prior to
similar with the hush money payments case too. That's also the first time that legal theory, whatever it is in that case about Trump classifying his payments to Stormy Daniels in a certain way that now constitutes a felony as opposed to a lower charge. Exactly.
I mean, so what does that tell you? If we're now at the third, and we're going to get a fourth, but we're now as of now we're at number 3 of the indictments that are predicated on the construction of these elaborate, convoluted, new legal theories that were created solely to apply to Trump. Like, it's not as though Trump robbed a bank or something and then was charged with the statute that would ordinarily govern the robbing of a bank or be used to prosecute people who rob banks, right? No, they've manufactured or confabulated brand new legal theories in now 3 separate instances specifically to charge Trump. And the New York case is another example of that. They literally assert in that case that Trump defrauded himself by entering into his own corporate ledgers a description of payments that he had made for the made to Stormy Daniels to allegedly hush up his affair with Stormy Daniels. So he defrauded not the state of New York, not taxpayers, not the Campaign Finance Board of New York or the Federal Campaign Finance Commission. Trump defrauded himself. I mean, look at the indictment. It sounds crazy when I'm describing it, but that's what they did. And this is a clear trend with the January 6th indictment this week, probably being the most dramatic example of a brand new legal theory developed basically out of thin air for no purpose other than to target Trump.
Yeah, and this comes after they framed him as a Russian agent and consumed his presidency with that. And then when they realized there was nothing there, then they pivoted to accusing him of obstruction of the investigation into the fake claim he was a Russian agent, which again, also they had nothing there either, because Robert Mueller, who investigated all this, declined to even make a call on whether or not he committed obstruction. He just put it out there that he might have committed obstruction. These are some possible cases. And this was part of a multi-year campaign, as you pointed out, long before January 6th happened, where Democrats were openly calling for Trump's prosecution. In fact, I believe they were basically calling for his impeachment since the day he took office, if not before. And
pretty much, yeah.
It's like we're expected to forget all that context every time one of these new indictments is handed down.
Didn't Kamala Harris criticize the Garland Justice Department for not indicting Trump and not building these cases to prevent him from running again? I mean, I see.
Oh, I just pulled up a clip last night of Kamala Harris in an.
I got it right here.
Yeah, what she said. This is when she was running for president in her, hilariously failed presidential primary campaign, where
zero delegates.
She was criticizing the Trump Justice Department for allegedly interfering in political affairs, or rather, the Trump White House interfering in the Trump Justice Department's conduct of criminal investigations. And yet Kamala Harris was saying that it's unmissable, or it's unmistakable, or it's inevitable that the Trump that Trump would have to be prosecuted once he leaves office. Meaning she was.
Let's watch that clip, Michael. Let's watch that clip.
Let's talk about now the former special counsel Robert Mueller's appearance in front of Congress last week. When asked whether or not the president could be charged with a crime after leaving office, his answer was yes. Senator Harris, you've criticized President Trump for interfering with the Justice Department. And just last month, you said if you were elected president, your Justice Department would, quote, have no choice and should go forward with the obstruction of justice charges against former President Trump. Why is it okay for you to advocate for the Justice Department to prosecute somebody, but President Trump, not him?
Well, I would never direct the Department of Justice to do whatever it believes it should do. But listen, look, we all watched his testimony. I read the report. There are 10 clear incidents of obstruction of justice by this president, and he.
It's not true, by the way. The report lays out 10 possible cases, but and this is the part that everybody, Kamala Harris included, forgets, is the Mueller team even offered the counter arguments as to why it would not be obstruction of justice. And one of the points they made was that, well, he wasn't guilty of the underlying crime of being a Russian conspirator. So how can you obstruct an investigation into something you're not guilty of? That was one of the arguments that Mueller even acknowledged, but we're supposed to forget.
Yeah.
He needs to be held accountable.
Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, yeah, because remember, the thinking at the time was that but for this memo sitting somewhere in the Justice Department that gave an opinion as to the ability of the Justice Department to charge a sitting president, Trump would clearly be charged because he was so clearly guilty of a vast number of crimes outlined allegedly in the Mueller report. So that was Kamala Harris saying that basically on principle, it was necessary to prosecute Trump. It wasn't even necessarily contingent there on what was in the Mueller report. She uses the Mueller report kind of as a pretext, or the claims of obstruction kind of as a pretext. But then 4 years later, the zeal with which they were saying that Trump needed to be prosecuted given these obstruction offenses or alleged obstruction offenses related to the Mueller investigation are nowhere to be found. They've been forgotten. And Trump is being prosecuted for other stuff because the underlying principle was never about the exact nature of the offense that Trump was alleged to have committed, but it was about the overriding need to prosecute Trump, and then finding a crime that fit the fit the bill.
Right. I mean, Russiagate created the sense that he's some kind of criminal installed by a foreign power, and everything flows from there. Even if they couldn't nail him on that, that's the goal.
Yeah. And also note what. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I got 5 minutes here. Just kind of a broader question. So much of this indictment seems to hinge on things Trump said in public, and it doesn't, in my view, meet the standard for judicial or legal precedent on incitement to violence. I don't think, and this has been debated publicly, where even liberal pro-Democratic Party scholars said he didn't go as far as those previously prosecuted for incitement because he didn't directly tell his followers to attack the Capitol. So what kind of precedent does this indictment set for free speech, freedom of assembly, the right to protest, when I don't believe our electoral system is, I question our electoral system. I even question the 2020 election. I mean, so many ballots sent, so many ballots were mailed in. Beyond that, you had the whole cover up of the Hunter Biden laptop, the lies deployed by intelligence officials. I mean, there were so many aspects of rigging that don't relate to voting machines. Just because Lynn Wood came out and made these ridiculous statements about Venezuela controlling the voting machines, the whole Dominion system sham, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be questioning our electoral system. It doesn't mean that the 2000 election wasn't obviously stolen. I mean, so what precedent does this set for the First Amendment?
Yeah, well, notably, Jack Smith does not bring an incitement charge, despite it having been recommended by the January 6th House Committee, because that would have had much more explicit bearing on the First Amendment. Now, it still has a bearing on the First Amendment, the charges that have been brought, but not in that more direct kind of flagrant sense, because, again, he's sort of bundling up a whole array of behavior and speech into now what is being alleged to be a criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States or to deprive people of rights. So interestingly, the charge that is brought, and this is kind of the charge that brings together the whole case, is a conspiracy against rights. That's what it's called in the statute book. It derives from a law that was first enacted in 1866 after the Civil War to target armed vigilante groups like the KKK in the Reconstruction South that were going after newly enfranchised blacks and either depriving them of the ability to vote that had been afforded under the 14th Amendment or going after them and even coercing them into voting for KKK-backed candidates. That's what one of the sponsors of the legislation way back then said was the purpose of this bill. And if you look at how this statute has been used even in the more recent past, the Department of Justice in its own internal guidelines, and I have them and I'm actually working on a piece now that's almost done that goes through this in some more detail. But this bill has been used largely, or this criminal statute has largely been used to prosecute perpetrators of, for example, cross burnings on the front lawns of Black families, or when Black families have been driven out of towns. In other words, it's been used largely for kind of explicit racial violence, because the claim is you can connect that the action taken against the Black family to the deprivation of certain rights that are afforded under the Constitution. And so it's pretty vague, but the common practice had been by the Justice Department to use it in those instances. And now they've turned that on its head and used it against Trump, as though he is now in the same sort of lineage in questioning or contesting the 2020 election results with cross burnings on the front yards of Black families. And so the connotation of that is pretty obvious. Jack Smith, when he introduced the charges at his press conference on Tuesday night, came out and the first thing he said essentially was that Trump was guilty of a conspiracy to disenfranchise voters. Now, that suggests that Trump blocked or impeded the ability of voters to vote in the election, which he didn't do. In fact, the 2020 election had the highest turnout of any election since the year 1900. But now they're kind of inverting that logic and saying that Trump's post-election conduct, questioning the veracity of the results or the submission of electors to Congress, that's now a deprivation of the right of the ability of people to vote. So again, he's twisting and contorting things, meaning Jack Smith is, to apply a set of facts to this alleged criminal violation that nobody really would have been thought was fathomable prior to the determination being made that Trump needed to be prosecuted for January 6th, and so we'll figure something out.
Well, Michael, thanks so much for breaking this down. I have to go. I welcome you all continuing.
Yeah, I'll go for a little while longer if you want.
Sure. Yeah, we can go for a little while longer.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to jump off here and thank you all for being with us, though, and for all your support. Thanks for liking the stream and for subscribing. If you're not on our newsletter, sign up. I'll be checking in with you next week. And Aaron and Michael are going to continue the conversation about this, the fascist threat to the shining city on the hill of American democracy.
All right, Mac. And I know you can't. I know Max can only handle so much of my brilliance. That's why he just scurried off. Aaron, let me give you a quick example of what I'm talking about here in terms of how this particular statute has generally been used in the very recent past. I pulled up the 2022 edition of what's called the Department of Justice Journal of Federal Law and Practice, which is essentially like an internal journal for U.S. attorneys as to how certain statutes ought to be employed. And in 2022, this statute that Trump was charged with, under which Trump was charged, is said to be a civil rights conspiracy statute that was enacted over a century ago in response to acts of racial violence committed by the Ku Klux Klan, and it remains a powerful tool in the government's efforts to combat racially motivated crimes of violence. So that's the kind of offense that it was used in relation to for decades. That was basically the precedent up until this week, because Trump isn't accused of committing any racially motivated violence or any kind of racially inflected offense at all. That's nowhere alleged in the indictment. It's that he committed this more intangible disenfranchisement, allegedly, by taking action that called into doubt the veracity of certain states' election procedure and vote tabulation. So again, it's the point being, it's precedent smashing in a way that all the previous indictments have been precedent smashing, because they haven't used something that is clearly delineated in federal law to go after Trump, because there's nothing available. So they have to, again, do very arduous mental gymnastics to figure out what could be applicable.
And let me ask you about a point that I saw Li Fang made, the journalist Li Fang, who said that, if I understand his argument correctly, because Trump is accused of obstructing a ministerial proceeding or an official proceeding, that charge could be now weaponized against, for example, left-wing activists who disrupt Congress, like Code Pink does all the time. When if there's like some war criminal or policy, evil policymaker speaking, Code Pink will protest and during a congressional hearing. Lee Fong was saying that under the Trump precedent of this indictment, that could be weaponized against activists like that. Do you agree with that?
Partially, but with the qualifier that January 6th defendants, meaning just regular people who were there at the riot, have already been charged with obstruction of an official proceeding, basically since the very moment that the DOJ launched into action in the aftermath of January 6th. So this isn't unique to Trump. But it is notable that Trump is being charged with obstruction of an official proceeding, because if you look at who the DOJ has generally charged with that same offense, it has tended to be people or alleged perpetrators who took some sort of action that is claimed to be violent, whether it's they scuffled with police or they bashed through a window or they did something physically improper in their entry to the Capitol, and then that is used as sort of the way to hinge their violation on this obstruction of an official proceeding charge. But this is to charge it against Trump is novel because obviously Trump was not physically present in the Capitol. And so they're stretching the bounds of that obstruction charge even further and saying that Trump obstructed the proceeding by not doing anything physical, by just, engaging in this alleged conspiracy to question the election results. So,
all right. Well, listen.
Actually, Aaron, they use now in the sentencing phase of these prosecutions of ordinary rioters on January 6th. What the government has had a penchant of doing is that once they're coerced into pleading guilty, meaning these guys who were in the Capitol physically, the government then at the sentencing phase of the proceeding invokes an upward revision of the statutory guidelines to argue for them spending even more time in prison by saying that their conduct in disrupting the official proceeding or obstructing it constitutes a terrorism offense. So they've used now this rhetoric of terrorism, and they've used this sentencing upward revision that was founded right after 9/11 in the Patriot Act to go after people who could have just been physically inside the Senate chamber for 30 seconds. So.
All right, as we start to wrap up, let's have some laughs because you've posted some really funny clips of the media fawning over this indictment, fawning over Jack Smith. Let's start with MSNBC's Chris Hayes.
This is the best. Wait, but Aaron, before we begin, look at Rachel's face as she's doing this. Look at Rachel's face as Chris is going through this stirring oration that he clearly planned ahead of time and found all the right Abraham Lincoln quotes to invoke. Rachel looks at him like he's he just won a spelling bee in 5th grade or something. Like she's such a proud parent.
Yes, she's so proud of her boy. Yes, yeah, and look how good he is now. And
also look at the dramatic camera movement too. It's like they're really building up the theatricality of this.
Action, which is just a personal one, and having covered this, I think, like all of us have, and many of the viewers are in the weeds of it too, is right, yes, I'm not crazy. Yeah. If this wasn't a crime, nothing is a crime. We watched.
Wait, if this wasn't a crime, nothing is a crime. So if you don't charge Trump under this novel, unprecedented legal theory, then I don't know, murder is now, that's not a crime. You know what I mean? That's what he's saying.
According to Chris Hayes, Trump blurting out kind of incoherent grievances about voting election administration procedure in Wisconsin is the most obvious possible criminal activity that he can possibly fathom in his head.
Yeah.
Which gets to his psychology, frankly.
And again, I mean, I'm pretty sure you could make a criminal case against everybody involved in Russiagate who framed Trump as a Russian agent and, criminalized diplomacy with Russia and fed false claims to the media and to the FBI, definitely weaponized government, definitely misled the public, lied to the public. but I'm not sure. I'm not like 100% sure that it's a crime. It's corrupt and it's, you know, morally depraved, but I'm not 100% convinced it's a crime. And I wouldn't say that murder is not a crime if you can't charge somebody with a Russiagate crime.
Yeah, and when did this assumption come in that any action that you find to be politically objectionable has to therefore also be criminalizable?
Yes.
I mean, Peter Strzok opening the initial Crossfire Hurricane investigation, as the Durham report outlined, by reading a blog post and not even consulting with the officials in the FBI who are supposedly big experts on Russian affairs.
Yeah.
Could that be seen as reckless or negligent enough that could warrant some kind of critical scrutiny? I don't know. It's possible, but I'm not going to necessarily leap to that being criminal, because that's a giant step to take.
Yes.
That takes it outside the realm of kind of ordinary political contestation and into the realm of criminal law.
And that's where I thought here a fair remedy was impeachment. This is actually a case where, unlike the first impeachment, which I thought was ridiculous, this impeachment I thought had some merit, because Trump did act pretty reckless. He did do something that I think was an abuse of his office, or at least arguable. So I thought impeachment, that was a fair remedy, but that's a political act. This is now using the criminal justice system as a remedy for what he did. And as we've talked about, it's not nearly so clear at all, at least not nearly as clear as Chris is making it out to be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I quite agree about the second impeachment, not because I found Trump's conduct to be particularly defensible. I was inundated with right-wing trolls online for months telling me that I was the crazy one by just pointing out the obvious falsity of a huge multitude of Trump statements as to the voting count in Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee. I mean, I actually went through it with a fine-tooth comb just to shut these people up, like empirically, but of course it didn't work. But when they ended up impeaching him in the House, they used articles of impeachment, the text of which actually accused Trump of incitement. I mean, it accused him of these speech-infringing offenses that, if translated into criminal law, would be hugely stifling of the First Amendment. And even though it's technically only a political remedy, it's still precedent setting to use speech as an offense in that way. And so even if you did object to Trump's conduct, I'm not sure that the way that they went about punishing it in the form of that impeachment is particularly defensible. Okay. And we see what it's led to now. I mean, they use that as basically a formula to go after Trump in a criminal vein, and now they've gotten their wish.
All right, back to Chris.
Him do it on television. We sat at this desk a year ago at the January 6th committee. We knew what he was doing. If that is not a crime, then nothing.
Yeah, I think what he's betraying there is some frustration that nobody else cared about the January 6th hearings except for MSNBC hosts. Like, we sat at the table, we watched, we weren't crazy. We spent all of our time talking about the January 6th hearings, which no one cared about, because who cares? And that's what I think Chris is getting at there.
Yeah, he's complaining about being gaslit. I think that would be the proper term to use, by not every American sharing his monomaniacal fixation on the meaningless minutia of every little January 6th detail. Like, it's not as though Chris was the only one covering it. Others have covered it. I covered it when it comes up. I covered it at the time, etc. But like, I didn't devote my life to every useless little twist and turn in the whole saga at the direction of Liz Cheney and Benny Thompson, who ran this select committee in the House. And that's what Chris is, I guess, retroactively kind of criticizing others for not doing, because that's what his life has revolved around for the past 2.5 years. And now he feels like it's been vindicated because Jack Smith resurrected an 1866 criminal conspiracy statute. All right.
Yes.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Nothing is a crime. So that part of it is just like, I find really important and gratifying. I mean, there's a kind of ballast to it. Yes, of course, this was corrupt. Of course, this was fraud. Of course, it was a conspiracy to defraud the U.S. We all saw him engage in the conspiracy to defraud the U.S.
Millions of people have gaslit Chris Hayes, and he had the last laugh because Jack Smith validated him. He vindicated him. So, yes, there's a ballast there, as he said. All right, we can make fun of this, but there's another aspect to this which we're going to make more fun of. So here it is.
Second thought I had it's just about the magnitude of this moment, which I think is just worth taking a second on. I mean, with Donald Trump, lots of things are unprecedented. The first time he was indicted was unprecedented, and the second time he was indicted was unprecedented because of the federal indictment had never come down. This is in the canon of American events, January 6th and its aftermath. And the reason is that for 159 years after the cannons fire on Fort Sumter, there is an unbroken chain of peaceful transfer of power. And not only that,
wait, Aaron, pause. You gotta start up. You gotta start up the dramatic orchestral arrangement to underlay his recitation here. Like it's like we're like some kind of 18th century concert.
Score. But enlighten me here. I'm Canadian. I don't really care about American Civil War history. So when he's talking about the cannons firing on Fort Sumter, what is that? The war for independence? Like, what's he talking about?
No. So that's literally the opening salvo of the American Civil War.
The Civil War, okay.
That was in South Carolina when Confederate soldiers for the first time opened fire, meaning cannon fire, on Union forces who were attempting to prevent South Carolina from seceding from the Union. So that's what he's likening in magnitude.
The QAnon shaman. The QAnon shaman.
Yeah, to the shirtless yodeling QAnon shaman running around and trying to overthrow the government by just thinking about it real hard in his blinkered mind. I mean, he thought that it later was stated in court proceedings that the QAnon shaman thought that he was being mind controlled from outer space.
Yes.
So yeah, that seems about on par with
just as the Confederate generals did, right? Didn't they have the same? Yeah,
pretty much the same.
Yeah. Okay.
To be true to the radical promise of democracy. That is why Lincoln says at the battlefield at Gettysburg that the question before the nation is whether a nation of, by, and for the people can long endure. It is a test whether the thing can last. And that's in a category of itself in American history, the Civil War and the death and misery. But this is the gravest political crime since secession.
Oh my God. I love that. He realizes, I think, how ridiculous he sounds. So he says, yeah, okay, so the Civil War, right? That's in a category of its own in terms of like the death toll and all the suffering. Okay, but this January 6th is the biggest thing since then. And therefore it's comparable. And therefore let's equate the two.
See, I think it's giving him too much credit to assume that he's conceding that the comparison is ridiculous. I think he genuinely has to believe it on some level, hence his profound psychic gratification about supposedly being vindicated for the thing that he's fixated on in the past 2.5 years. But remember, what is he referring to? What is he saying is the worst crime since secession? It was a temporary interruption of a legislative proceeding in Congress that had no bearing on the supposedly peaceful transfer of power, which was never interrupted in the first place. And the only person who was actually violently killed pursuant to this event was actually one of the Trump supporters, Ashley Baba, who was shot at point blank range in the throat and killed.
Yeah.
That's what he's saying is the gravest political crime since 1861.
Oh my God. I mean, I can think of, for example, the killing of Fred Hampton. I mean, there's a million examples, an actual political crime, an actual abuse of authority with real consequences.
How about just all the examples of presidents using deceit to bring the country into war or to escalate wars?
Yeah,
like, why is that not a political crime that occurs to Chris Hayes as being on the order of January 6th? Like January 6th is just above and beyond. Like even just let's just go in the past 20 years, not Iraq. I mean, Chris Hayes was the Washington editor of The Nation when that was going on.
He came of age during that time. I mean, he was. That's why I know of him. It was during that period of against the Bush administration. Anyway, do we have to watch any more of this clip, or can we take ourselves out of?
No, you get the idea.
Okay, all right. So let's do one more, and this is just kind of a throwback to Mueller time when Robert Mueller was all of a sudden everyone's crush, and there were these fawning profiles of him in the New Yorker style section and Vogue magazine about how stylish and handsome he was. So now Jack Smith is the new, white prosecutor filling the role of of going after Trump, and therefore he gets elevated to, you know, daddy status in a psychological sense. So this is a clip that you pulled, Michael, from CBS News talking about the heartthrob Jack Smith.
Yeah, and this is right as Trump was in the courtroom yesterday being arraigned. This was their live coverage at the moment when the most people presumably were tuned in to CBS.
Okay.
We've just been told that Donald Trump has entered the courtroom. Also in the courtroom is the special counsel, Jack Smith. And I want to spend a moment on Jack Smith because he is essentially who Donald Trump is up against in multiple of these indictments. The two, of course, the classified documents and the January 6th one. And they are sitting across from each other inside this courtroom. Jack Smith is someone who has run over and competed in over 100 triathlons. He was reportedly at one point hit when he was on his bike by a truck. And 10 weeks later, he ran another triathlon.
Sounds like he has a lot of stamina and endurance and courage, like, because he's done over 100 triathlons. And
yeah, so not only does he have legal and prosecutorial courage, he has raw physical courage, like a Roman warrior or something who chased down the insurrectionary hordes back, 2,000, 4,000 years ago or whatever to defend the Roman Empire. That's what they're likening him to. I mean, like he's riding a chariot with like a flame and something like that. That's what it sounds like.
Oh man.
This is a man of a lot of grit and a lot of determination. Yes. And even what we have seen in these indictments is just a sliver of what they know and his prosecutorial team knows, right?
His aggressive approach to his personal health and exercise correlates to how he approaches his prosecution and his strategy. We've talked a lot about how the former president is under pressure, but Jack Smith is also under pressure today.
And that's Robert Costa, right? That's like their chief Washington correspondent. His approach to his personal health mirrors his legal strategy. Or
chief Washington correspondent. He's often a fill-in host on Face the Nation, the flagship Sunday morning show.
Yes.
Actually started at the National Review, believe it or not. People may forget. But yeah, he's just smitten. I mean, but think about what they did there. I mean, it's easy and necessary to laugh scoffingly at the idolization of Jack Smith, which they've done, now for just the latest iteration of this kind of idolatry, right, with Mueller and so forth. But they said, okay, now let's talk a little bit about Jack Smith. And the only details they gave were about his noble, personal habits, exercise. I'm assuming he has the right diet. He probably, is very caring with his wife and children.
Yes.
He's a fastidious, a reader of novels. I don't they gave nothing about his actual legal background or what he's done as a prosecutor, as if that's irrelevant.
Which apparently is actually not that impressive from whatever, but I don't know.
No, I mean, it's far from not being impressive. Number one, I mean, maybe the most egregious is that he was responsible, or he was one of the line prosecutors for the prosecution of John Edwards, which fell apart.
Which is relevant to Trump's Stormy Daniels case, because that's about how you categorize hush money payments. Money payments, so, yeah.
Right. Well, that's why it had that particular offense had to be prosecuted on a state level by the Manhattan District Attorney. That's not being prosecuted in federal court.
Right. Yeah.
So you can claim different precedents are operative.
Right.
He prosecuted he prosecuted Bob McDonnell, who the governor of Virginia, Republican governor of Virginia, on supposed bribery grounds. He concocted a new theory of criminal conspiracy to prosecute Bob McDonnell. And then once it finally reached the Supreme Court unanimously vacated the conviction. So everybody from Ruth Bader Ginsburg to Clarence Thomas agreed that the conviction of Bob McDonnell had been unconstitutional. Now, I don't know what constitutes as a really egregious offense for a prosecutor, or something that could dampen your prosecutorial star, but that probably seems like maybe one of them. Even if you go back further, he was a prosecutor in New York State, a federal prosecutor in New York State, and he was reprimanded by a judge so resoundingly that the judge threw out the death penalty conviction of a guy in Staten Island who had been found guilty of murdering 2 NYPD detectives. Jack Smith's misconduct in the sentencing phase of that particular proceeding was seen as so egregious by the judge that he set aside the death penalty conviction of a convicted cop murder. I mean, which means it has to have been pretty bad.
Well, maybe these judges weren't aware of his triathlon record.
Another thing, though, Aaron, is that this really should be seen as damaging in light of the incredulity that it betrays about how the media is covering these prosecutions. Like, if all we need to know about Jack Smith and the prosecution writ large is that he has these really relatable personal characteristics, then you don't have to look into whether there had been any undue political influence in bringing about the prosecutions. You don't have to question whether there were political factors that gave rise to the bringing of the charges, whether in this case or in the classified documents case. Joe Biden is just is completely beyond reproach, apparently, even though the New York Times reported that he had privately reprimanded Merrick Garland, for not aggressively prosecuting Trump enough. Yes. Not going hard enough after Trump. And then they leaked that to the New York Times through confidants. And, all of a sudden the supposedly private comments were no longer private and influence is exerted on the attorney general. Like, none of that bears any investigation because all we need to know is that there's this glorious, corrupt, untainted prosecutor who's going to save democracy for us.
Yes. And meanwhile, when Trump would call for prosecuting his political opponents, that was a threat to democracy. So another case where the standard.
If Trump just sniffed in the direction of the Department of Justice, then it was that day's meltdown where we had to all run around about how we were being overtaken by fascism. But I mean, there's even a long Washington Post article that came out fairly recently where they have sources who say outright that political pressure exerted on the Justice Department is what led to the department pursuing January 6th related charges against Trump that there was initially some resistance to bringing because of the potentially grave implications given Trump's role as like the standard bearer of the Republican Party. But we don't need to look into that any further or with any degree of skepticism because although we were all supposed to be in a constant panic about anything that Trump tweeted that could be interpreted as potentially reflecting undue political influence exerted on the Justice Department. Now it's just a blank slate or just a free rein for anybody who wants to do anything against Trump. Even they resurrected the Espionage Act.
Yeah,
they're charging Trump. They're charging Trump.
Hear that? Yeah,
yeah, they're charging Trump under the same statute that they charged Assange, Manning, Snowden, Ellsberg, etc. with, and that's just supposed to be completely normal.
And the last thing I want to say on this is that, again, I mean, the fact that this is so easily called an insurrection, a coup, and when you compare this to actual coups where people lose their lives, where the military is involved, where all the things that go into a coup actually happen, as opposed to this, which is you have a 3-hour riot and you have the QAnon shaman pretending to be the leader for a few minutes. We're supposed to take all of this as comparable. And meanwhile, these same people get up and cheer Juan Guaido when he comes into their chamber as he's trying to lead an insurrection in Venezuela, which they're all supporting. And that's one of the many reasons why I cannot take any of this stuff seriously. And Michael Tracey, you've given us so many more. So I'm very grateful to you for joining us today. Anything more you want to leave us with?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, to your point there, one of the ironies is that the principal reason why it was so ridiculous for Trump and MAGA supporters to be hyping January 6th in the first place prior to it coming was they had basically woven together a nonsensical new theory of their own, which is that the symbolic or ceremonial legislative proceeding that takes place on January 6th was somehow outcome determinative of who wins the presidential election. I mean, nobody had ever really even entertained that as a viable theory before, because according to the Constitution, or according to like a plain reading of the Constitution, once the Electoral College convenes, which it already had by January 6th for a number of weeks, and elects the next president, as they had with Joe Biden, then that's it. I mean, it's not as though like the vice president all of a sudden like gets this weird veto power over the state's certification of their electoral votes. So it was kind of ridiculous for them to puff it up in importance in the way that they did. But then, ironically, the anti-Trump crowd has also puffed up the significance of January 6th to say that the actual fate of the government itself was on the line in that legislative proceeding. Meaning, if Pence had succumbed to the pressure that was being imposed on him by Trump, that would have overthrown the government. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, the actual power vested in the state power is vested in the members of Congress, who, whatever building they happen to be in, can convene in a parliamentary sense and conduct business. So they've assigned all this like weird quasi-mystical importance to January 6th in the same sort of way that the Trump supporters initially did. And they liken it to actual coups that do take place around the world. It was funny. I was just refreshing my memory today because if you recall, like 3 weeks or so after January 6th of 2021, there was a genuine military coup in Myanmar, where a military junta seized power, deposed the elected leaders, and dissolved the existing framework of government and began ruling the country with an iron fist. You know, thousands of civilians were killed, according to various organizations. And these kind of self-aggrandizing, fantastically like over-exaggerating liberals view January 6th, which was essentially a goofball mob intrusion that was dispersed within about 2 or 3 hours. They liken that in their imagination to actual military coups that take place. So they see themselves as comparably victimized as the people in Myanmar or recently in Niger in Africa, who are being cracked down upon by like literal military juntas that seize power. They think that that's what they think that just entering the capital, which had been and violating COVID restrictions that had been in place at the time, that's a coup on the order of a military junta actually like dissolving a country's constitution and taking over the functions of the state. That's the level of delusion that they've reached.
Michael Tracey is on Twitter at mtracy and also writes on Substack at mtracy.substack.com. Michael, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. It was great to talk to you.
All right. As enjoyable as ever. And I know I see you're laughing, but I couldn't be more sincere. I mean, look at my face. This is a solemn week. Yes,
yeah,
we should let's reflect on the magnitude of this moment.
Yes, let's reflect on let's follow Chris Hayes' lead and reflect. Right. All right, Michael, thanks so much for joining us. Good to see you.
All right.
Bye.
Take care.
All right, we're going to wrap it there. As we're speaking, if you're watching this live, Max Blumenthal is on the Jimmy Dore Show, so go watch him there. Otherwise, check out thegrayzone.com. If you haven't seen it yet, I did an interview recently with John Mearsheimer, the eminent political scientist, about Ukraine. I highly recommend that if you haven't seen it. It was great. And go to thegrayzone.com for more. And thanks for joining us. Bye, everybody.